All right. Hi, everybody. Hi. How's everyone's summit going? Yeah? Very, very good. Well, I am excited to have you here. I have been looking forward to being a part of this incredible panel. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Edgar B. Herwick III. I'm a journalist here at GBH in the local newsroom. I'm a co-host on our arts and culture radio show, which is called The Culture Show. Not exactly the most creative title, but we went all the way around the earth with ideas for titles and came back to, how about just The Culture Show? And then I also run this little outfit that we do here, which has been going on for years across a bunch of different platforms called the Curiosity Desk. So we do radio features and short videos and longer videos, and a lot of it all just kind of using the idea of curiosity as a springboard. So that's kind of what I'm about, but this panel is not really about me, which is great. We've got three amazing panelists here who are going to share some wisdom and challenge us and make us think. Just in case you don't know where you're at, the name of this is Making Room for Paradox, How Embracing Complex Narratives Enhances Connection, which, to me, sounds like a very interesting notion, right? I love the idea of paradox. Paradox is a word that I find to be very fascinating, especially there's not just one kind of paradox, right? There's the liar. Everybody know the liar's paradox, right? This statement is false, and it cannot be false or true. If it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's true, right? So there's that type of paradox that is like a David Lynch movie or a Mobius strip. It's unresolvable. But then there's also paradoxes like the ship of Theseus, right? This idea of you've got this boat, and planks of wood over the years are replaced one after the other, and by the end, the entire boat has been replaced, and then you ask the question, is this still the ship that it was? Now, in that case, that kind of paradox I find especially interesting because it challenges us in the idea that the notion of truth is even binary. Maybe it's on a spectrum. And that, I think, especially as journalists, can be uncomfortable. And so, hopefully, we can all get a little uncomfortable here over the next hour, and that's what I'm hoping for. We'll see what we get out of it. But as I said, so here's what's going to happen. We've got three panelists. Each of them is going to dispense some wisdom. They're going to sort of share themselves, their knowledge, kind of on their own. We're going to hear from each of them individually. Then we're going to have some group discussion, and hopefully, if we have time at the end, we'll open it up for some questions from all of you. So, if you got something, if there's something as this is unfolding that you really want to ask, lock that away. We'll hopefully have some time for it at the end. Sound good? Yeah. Excellent. All right. So, our first speaker. How many times have we or you heard lately that we are in divisive times? We have never as a people been further apart. Yeah? Well, that sounds like there's a lot of space between us. And our first speaker is the person behind, an author, behind remaking the space between us. She's led change efforts for some 35 years at America's biggest businesses and at nonprofits. And she's got a patented leading through relationships approach. And as I said, her latest work as an author, Remaking the Space Between Us. And Diane McLain Smith, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what you mean by remaking the space between us.
Well, it's interesting. Every time I've ever talked with people about the book, the first thing they look at is remaking the space between groups. But before we can remake the space between groups, we have to remake the space within groups. Because over our history, not just now, but over the course of our history, starting in the origins, we've lived in separate lives in segregated groups. And those groups are divided along both demographic and ideological lines. And the more insular those groups become, the more distant they become from other groups. And the more distant they become from other groups, the more insular they become within. And that's a cultural problem. And one of the things I wanted to talk about today was how we've tried to handle that historically and some of the limitations of that. But most importantly, what people are doing now across the country, which we rarely hear about, it's all happening under the media radar, to open up the space within groups and to close the distance across them. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. But I wanted to start, and I'm now worried a little bit about the time because I just added a little bit to my
You
little
don't
spiel.
worry. We'll give you a little extra.
Okay, thank you. But one of the things I wanted to talk about is, we're about to celebrate 250 years since the Declaration of Independence was signed. That was a remarkable document. It really gave birth to what some consider to be the longest living democracy in the world. And so, it was extraordinary. And it made a series of declarations around all men are equal, endowed with inalienable rights, and that government is set up in order to protect those rights, given just powers by the consent of the governed. Okay, so it puts people at the center of our governance model. In only 20 years, George Washington, who declined to take a third role as president, a third office as president, he gave a farewell address. And many of you may have heard this address, but it's an extraordinary address because the most important thing he wanted to do was to warn us of the dangers against democracy, not from without, but embedded within democracy. And so one of the things he said, the biggest danger we'll face is the baneful effects of the spirit of party, which now would be called hyperpartisanship. Now, I think it goes beyond ideological divides and differences to include demographic divides and differences. But those are sometimes intimately related, but not completely. But he was very worried about this partisan reality that he could imagine taking place. And he said it exists under different shapes of all governments. So all governments have to contend with this. But those in the popular form, it is the greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy. So that's the paradox upon which we were founded. On the one hand, with the Declaration of Independence, we are given the ability to govern ourselves, we the people at the center of the enterprise. At the same time, we the people can become our own worst enemy. And that's a paradox I think we've wrestled with for 250 years. And this is where I think we have in some ways lost our way, because as T.S. Eliot put it, we dream of systems so perfect no one needs to be good. And so almost all of our attention is, let's pass a policy, let's pass a law, let's design. I can't tell you the number of times I was in organizations and they say, time for a restructure. Because manufacturing doesn't get together with marketing, and so we got to separate these guys, and then they separate them and they fight even worse. We got to bring them together because they're not talking enough. Same thing. So I have always thought that it requires us to pay attention to the relationships we build within groups and the relationships we build across groups. And so when I wrote my book, I did some research on what is happening across the country, where we're not just trying to create systems change. And what I discovered that as systems began to fail more and more, as our trust in institutions declined, as polarization skyrocketed, a new movement started to emerge, mostly under the radar of the media. Okay, it rarely gets reported. And in this loosely connected movement, literally millions of Americans across race, place, gender, age, and party are coming together to solve common problems in communities across our nation. They are working across divides in locally rooted and nationally connected groups. And they're doing three things. The first is they're opening up the mental space within insular, like-minded groups, because people are meeting each other for the first time across these divides. And they're actually seeing each other for who they are. And assumptions and stereotypes that they had begin to melt away. And the second thing is they're closing the social distance across historically separate groups. And those two things go together. The more you bring people together, the more you open up the internal space, the more. So those are absolutely vital to combine. And we keep trying to bridge the divides. And when I think of what I hear my friends saying about the other side, or the other side saying about, it's like we can't even begin, because if they said what they were thinking, it would be a disaster. So we have to begin by looking within at our own groups and ourselves. We have to then close the space across groups. Now, in doing this, what the research I've done suggests is that it begins to change the win-lose zero-sum assumptions that inflame our passions and make us our own worst enemies. Because they begin to see that it's not zero-sum. they begin to see that they can come up with solutions that actually work for everybody. And that then begins to transform the very cultural bases and beliefs that have led to these cyclical, violent, antagonistic dynamics amongst different groups. Now I want to just, because I'm getting near 40 seconds, wow, this is going to be tough. There are so many organizations outside of this room doing this, not in our town. Okay, it's an incredible organization. It started in reaction to hate crimes in Billings, Montana, and it has now grown to thousands of chapters across the country. And they're trying to build communities that create so much belonging, there's no room for hate. And when hate emerges, people basically say, not in our town, and they resist it. Urban-rural action. They were originally in 4 states and 4 counties, and they were doing extraordinary work working across divides on common problems. Tennessee 11, gun control rights activists, gun rights activists, gun control activists got together, talked about their experience of guns, drafted legislation, brought it to the Tennessee legislature. They declined it, but they started working together on what they could do. The list goes on and on. I mean, there are like thousands of these organizations. And the relationships these citizens are building across divides are based not on the zero-sum win-lose dynamics, but on 4 things: mutual learning, mutual responsibility, mutual benefit, and mutual trust. And this has allowed these groups to do something that we are not very great at doing in this country of ours, which is to imagine and create innovative solutions that improve the lives of people across groups and communities across our nation. And perhaps, maybe not intended, this is allowing humanity to get to the point where we don't just compete across groups, but we learn to cooperate. And they're showing again and again what is possible. When I was doing the tour for my book, the question I was asked more often than not was, is there hope for our democracy? And in answering, I relied on the wisdom of a Chinese philosopher by the name of Lin Yutang, who said, hope is like a road in the country. It comes into existence only after many people have walked on it. And it doesn't take that many people. As James Baldwin said, we are misled here because we think of numbers. You don't need numbers, you need passion. And right now, largely under the media's radar, millions of passionate Americans across our country are remaking the space between us. And imagine what would happen if the media were covering that as rigorously as they covered moments of outrage. It would completely transform things. I understand I was a journalist once, all the impediments to that. But there are a lot of people out there who would be thirsty for those stories. And I went over 2 minutes, sorry.
I think that's okay. Diane McLain Smith. So I hear, and Sebene, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I hear something in what Diane is saying that reminds me of your work, which is to say this implication of maybe that we have more power than we think we have to make this change, right? That there's a little bit of a paradox in that, this idea that we're sort of out there looking at the state of affairs and feeling powerless, but we actually maybe have way more power to make this change than we realize. That's kind of what your whole take is to a certain extent, maybe?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you. And thank all of you. I'm very honored to be here. And yes, I focus on spiritual and personal transformation, and really humbled to be in a room of people who are doing real work out there to make change. I literally am paid to teach people to sit around and do nothing. I'm a meditation teacher. And so, I come here with humility in terms of the work that I do and how it differs from that on-the-ground work in these communities. And also, I'm making a case for the contemplative perspective, which is that turn inward of empowerment, to say that we can make change within ourselves, and that change is not only important and impactful, but really, I think, vital and necessary. So to give you a little bit of a background, I am half Ethiopian, half Eritrean. I was born in Ethiopia, but my dad is Eritrean, and so I grew up with the Eritrean freedom struggle. And like many Eritreans, I had many members in my family. It was mostly male members who were Marxist guerrilla fighters. including my father, who is also a scholar. And these were brilliant people who were trying to lead a revolution filled with integrity and deep values, and it really went sideways. So Eritrea is, for decades now, one of the most extreme authoritarian regimes. And that fact reminds me of this Bell Hooks quote, which I shared with you all the other day, the late Black feminist scholar. She said, if you are effed up and you lead the revolution, you're going to have an effed up revolution. And this work of inner transformation is so necessary, and it's paradoxical. As I shared in the meditation this morning, mindfulness meditation invites us to be with all the complexities of our experience, including the challenges. Things are not okay right now. We are uncomfortable, we are dysregulated, and we don't need to pathologize that. That makes sense that we're not comfortable with what's happening. And we need to work with that. And so how do we work with that without just going into the doing, but actually tending to ourselves, taking care, not just as another tool for optimization. We don't meditate so then we can go out and do more. We do that so that we really understand our human nature, our beingness, that we are human beings, not only human doings. And so, it's not to judge or abandon the actions that we have to take, but it's to really balance that with this understanding that the nature of reality is paradoxical. So I'm trained in a Buddhist tradition, and in many Buddhist lineages, there's this understanding of paradox. It's called the paradox of the two truths. And the first truth is the absolute truth, that we are fundamentally interconnected, that there is an inherent interdependence with all of the universe and all of nature. We are also nature. That, as one physicist put it to me, we are all ultimately vibrating energy patterns connected to everything throughout space and time. This is true. There's also the relative truth, that we are individual beings with our own histories, our own realities, that the diversity of that is beautiful and wonderful, and the complexities of that are very challenging. How do we hold those two truths? We can fall into the trap of spiritually bypassing into the absolute truth and sort of going into the we're all one kind of nonsense, really, that is ignoring what's happening. We don't want to bury our heads in the sand. And for a lot of us who do value justice, equality, peace, freedom for all, we can also fall into the trap of only relying on the relative truth, kind of digging our heels in the sand, taking sides, and forgetting this interconnection. And fundamentally, forgetting the indigenous wisdom that we are connected. I many years ago, I'm not on social media anymore, I was following an indigenous activist, and she posted a video of a white supremacist rally, and there was a white man spewing nonsense. And she wrote underneath in the caption, "Look at this confused relative." And I don't want to kind of say that this is the viewpoint of all indigenous wisdom or indigenous leaders, but I was so struck by that, both the relative part, that we are relatives to each other, but also the confused part, because we're at the point where there are people who are confused to the point of derangement. And we don't want to underplay that and really understand the need that we have to take, the actions that we have to take to protect and defend those that need that defense and protection, and what that might involve. But we also want to make sure that we do that with love. We do that with an open-heartedness that really understands that connection that we have to all beings. And how to do that really requires the contemplative way. It requires the contemplative practice that asks us to connect to land, to connect to nature, to connect to wonder, to connect to awe, and to make time for that. It can seem like things are so urgent that all we can do is act. It's important. We all need to do that. And we also need to take the time to take care of ourselves, again, not just so we can do more, but so that we understand things from this deeper perspective, from this paradoxical truth that actually will bring transformation. And this is an embracement of mystery. of wonder. We don't know what will bring change. We can take the next right action that we think might be necessary, and we can do that in community and conversation, understanding what the best actions might be. But we also have to know that we're not in control. We don't know what might come. Really, Earth is in charge, because ultimately there are things that will happen, may happen, that we can't fix right away. And so how do we do that? And I really am making the call for the contemplative way, for the spiritual way, for a deeply soulful way. I'll just end with a very quick anecdote. Many years ago, I was at a conference on the Horn in East Africa, and there was a panel on Eritrea with many different disciplines, but mostly the usual suspects: poli-sci, law, anthropology, even linguistics was up there. And someone asked, what will be the discipline that really helps us understand what's happening, how we can stop this? And someone else wisecracked from the back of the room, psychology. And it really struck me, because psychology, psyche, the root of that is soul. It's not just about a mental understanding. This is really an invitation into a soulful re-enchantment with the world, that we lived in an ensouled universe, and that to ignore that is just to repeat the patterns of modernity that have really allowed us to abandon that way of being.
Sebene, Selassie. I should have gone to your meditation this morning. I realize this now. Our next speaker, Charles Eisenstein. I think themes in your work include civilizations defining myths, and I'm hearing sort of some of that coming out of Sebene as well, this idea of how we define ourselves, what is true of us. Charles is an author, authored many books, including Sacred Economics, and I have to say, excellently titled, The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know. I love that title. Most recently, he served as Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s speechwriter during the 2024 presidential campaign. And my understanding is somewhere along here, you started to zero in this idea of, and this is another great turn of phrase, the transcendent center. I would love it if you could share with us a little bit about the transcendent center.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for being here. When I came into the Kennedy campaign, I kind of came in with this proposal. I said, here's the 5 pillars of the campaign that I proposed. One of them was called Heal the Divide. And so I'm really happy to see that this theme is still alive, even though that campaign didn't end the way that I had hoped it would. It became very conventional after a certain point, and I had some serious disagreements with the candidate, and anyway, a human drama happened. But the Transcendent Center is actually all about paradox. It looks for what each side, locked in their logic, locked in their conceptual systems, cannot see. It looks for the questions that neither side asks. It looks for the agreements that they share that they might not be aware of, that prevent the meta-level agreements. So that is the nature of a paradox. A paradox, in a lot of spiritual traditions, the function of a paradox is to illuminate the inadequacy of your systems of understanding, of your systems of meaning, of your logic, to apprehend a problem. And the productive approach when you face a paradox is not to just run away from it and collapse into a familiar, simplifying understanding, Nor is it to say, well, it's just a paradox and we'll never understand it, so let's just kind of park it there and go on with things. A paradox is supposed to disturb you. It's what doesn't make sense and points to the opportunity to grow beyond where you had been. Well, obviously, speaking of our current political moment, we could really do with some holding of paradox, because we are trapped now in patterns of thought, in patterns of conflict, in solution templates that continue to regenerate the same problems again and again in different form. Some of the paradoxes that we face, that like some of them are very simple, but when you really hold them, they unravel everything. For example, the paradox that millions, maybe tens of millions of voters who voted for Donald Trump also voted for Barack Obama. For some of us, that's not really a paradox, but for many people, that would be a big paradox. Like, how could that be? Well, let's just not think about that too much. But if you really hold that paradox, it will lead you to an understanding that is unavailable from within the narrative of, MAGA is just channeling the darkest impulses in the American psyche of xenophobia and bigotry. Like, can that actually stand intact in juxtaposition with this other fact that I named? Or maybe another paradox would be that the Democratic Party, which is supposed to be the champion of the working class, is much wealthier now. If you look at the income profile of people who identify as Democrat. Okay, what do you do with that paradox? But the biggest paradox of all that I want to bring into the conversation, and it's been touched on in some of the earlier panels, is that when you actually interact with people who hold what might be repellent viewpoints, you find that they're not as ideology would paint them. They're not deficient in morals and intellect at all. In fact, they are decent, intelligent, caring people, just like your side is. Well, how could that be? So to hold that paradox will lead to a new understanding. Whereas the collapse of the paradox, you have to explain that away somehow. And you can talk about how they're just crazy, they're deluded, they have, Trump derangement syndrome. If you're on the right, you can explain those on the left. They're deranged. They've gone crazy. And the other side, both sides basically they offer the same diagnosis, that the other side is crazy, stupid, corrupt, degenerate, evil in some way. And that shows up in political rhetoric as well, that paints the other side as a threat to democracy itself. The result of being locked in to these simplifying narratives that repudiate paradox is that each side's narrative about the other intensifies and creates the other side in the image of what you think of them. And we've seen this example play out over the last 10 years, where when each side believes the other is a threat to democracy itself, a threat to all that is good and decent in the world, then any means are justified to defeat the other side. Things become very simple. The solution to the problem becomes very simple. We are programmed with this solution by entertainment media, by popular literature, but especially movies and television, where the solution to the problem is that you find the bad guy, you destroy the bad guy, you defeat the bad guy, and the problem is solved. That way of thinking And it goes even beyond the bad guy, and it doesn't have to be a human bad guy. It can be a terrorist, it could be a virus, it could be, but you have to have some identifiable threat that makes the complex simple. Okay, so we had this narrative that Trump and MAGA is a threat to democracy itself. Any means is justified to stop Hitler. So a campaign of lawfare, weaponization of the Justice Department, weaponization of the FBI, of the IRS, et cetera, et cetera. I know most people in this room are in a different information ecosystem and may not be aware of how 2020 to 2024 occurred to people on the right, which I do not identify actually as a person on the right. That's a whole other conversation. I mean, I'm like a anti-imperialist, post-capitalist, deep environmentalist, indigenous rights leftist, like verging on Marxist. But none of it doesn't matter because I was a COVID dissident. All of a sudden, I was on the right for dissenting from what I saw as a corporate-dominated narrative that served corporate interests. And why is that right now? But anyway, where was I here? Okay, so So in this other ecosystem, it seems like the federal government was weaponized against Donald Trump and his allies, and now they come into power and essentially do the same thing to their enemies. And if you talk to the people in the inner circle, and I have some connections there, I'm not part of it, but I hear things. I have conversations occasionally with people who are in those circles. They fully, sincerely believe that they are restoring the rule of law, that the people that they are prosecuting violated the law and the principles of the US Constitution. So we have a situation. It's like in sports, okay? For, say, football to work, both sides have to hold something more sacred than winning. Otherwise, you can poison your opponents, and you'll win, right? So you hold the game itself more sacred. Well, same thing you need for a functioning democracy as you need for a functioning football game. You have to hold something more sacred than winning. You have to hold democracy itself or the Constitution or something. And that is untenable when you believe the other side is the very embodiment of evil. So out of time here, but that's why I think it's so important in these times to be able to hold the paradox that violates that narrative, introduces some uncertainty and complexity, and motivates you to actually sit down with the other and understand where they're coming from. What questions are neither of you asking? What assumptions unconsciously are you holding in common?
Charles Eisenstein. Wow. Okay, there's a lot to talk about here, everybody. Whew. Can we all take a deep breath? Okay, so the first thing I would love to hear us get into a little bit is where does I find myself grappling with where trust comes into this, which is to say, I think that there's something very visceral, right, that people don't want to be hurt. And I hear you talking about, we demonize the other side or demonize the other or bridging these gaps and reasons that we create for why we need not engage but I think sometimes among them is this idea that you don't trust that they are operating in good faith. So it's one thing to go into a conversation with your whole self, but that I think that on a very deep level can be scary if you are worried that the person you are doing that with is not doing the same thing. So how do we grapple with that role of trust in this? Not only maybe do we demonize the other side, but we don't believe that they are coming to the conversation or the table in good faith.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
Because I think there's that question, and I appreciate how both of you are talking about these spaces and opportunities that we need to make for dialogue and connection. And there are things happening in real time that need to be stopped. And so I would love to also include in this conversation abandoning this talk of sides, right? And so instead of taking sides, taking stands. And taking a stand for what we believe in, which might not allow in a moment for the exact kind of time and energy it takes to create those connections, but it really indicates a change within ourselves in how we approach needing to protect, to defend, to hide, to, really, because these are actions that activists are having to take these past 100 days, every day.
Yeah, I think that what I'm talking about actually is completely consistent with taking a stand. It's not like because the other side or the other person or the ICE has their viewpoint, that you just let them do whatever they're going to do. But in fact, if you understand why somebody is doing what they're doing, where they're coming from, and you're not in the delusion that they're doing it just because they're hateful or they're evil, then you're actually going to be able to take a more effective stand as well.
Welcoming them as a confused relative from your perspective.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and maybe sometimes, you have to use force. Like, I'm not saying that there's never a time for a fight, but it's the habit of fighting and the habit of seeing everything in terms of a problem that can only be resolved by a fight. That is the pattern that has hypnotized humanity for thousands of years.
And you said something, it wasn't latent agreement, but sort of unconscious agreement. And I think there are places where we actually agree on certain values or interests or concerns or things that we'd like to see in the world, that if you appeal to that, people who appear to be an enemy all of a sudden become an ally, and they can even take the stand with you. So I think this notion that you can take a stand without taking sides, and without demonizing the other person. The way I talked about it when I worked in organizations was people had this incredible tendency to see the other side as either mad or bad. Mm-hmm. And that was basically it. Okay, and if that's, it's so patronizing, to think about it that way, and you don't begin to understand the things that they might care about that if you were to take into account might allow you to work together.
Diane, you talked early on about all these things that you have found happening that you're not seeing talked about in the press. Why do you think that is?
Oh, that's a big question, and it's one that I've obsessed about for about 40 years. I think it's one of those paradoxes again. I mean, I think there's a deep commitment on the part of people who enter journalism, it certainly was for me, to inform people about what's going on so that they can fulfill their role as a citizen and be responsible and informed. And there's also the need to stay alive and to make money. And there's no doubt that if you report stories about outrage and things that are going on that appeal to people's amygdala, it gets their attention and they'll go buy the paper. And so you've got this sort of dual motivation. Yep. And the second, I think, has washed out the first, because I think there's an assumption that you can't appeal to people in any other way, that is the only way you can sell papers. And so, I looked at some headlines in the paper just yesterday, and it was, "Will Musk and company move fast and break our brains? Mark Carney wins full term as Canada's prime minister on anti-Trump platform. Breaking news, power outage in Spain and Portugal causes chaos. Trump administration cracks down on foreign students. I mean, all of that appeals to our fears. And none of it is saying, and this has actually happened. People in Spain were coming together to deal with the chaos, okay? Those weren't the stories that were reported. So I think it's a complicated and unfortunate reality that the press is implicated. There are organizations like the Solutions Journalism Network that are trying to move in a different direction. I think they're doing an extraordinary job.
Well, what advice or what ought to, you talk about these competing pressures, to sell papers, but it's even, I mean, even just for a click, the marketplace is so flooded with stuff.
Yeah.
I guess my question is there a way for it to resolve? Like you talk about sitting with these paradoxes. There is this paradox, as you say a little bit, in this idea that maybe you go into journalism with the best intentions, and yet, these things, these kinds of headlines, this sort of coverage continues to work. So how does a journalist resolve that? I mean,
well, we don't have I would love to hear what others, but we don't have a control. I mean, there isn't a huge advance right now of news that is operating in a different way and going out and trying to find out what people are doing to solve these problems and to come together. That doesn't exist. So if it did exist, you could put them against each other and see who wins. Not that winning is everything, but
sure. No, I get what you're saying.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't have a lot of, or maybe any recommendations for journalism. It's not my wheelhouse, but I do study and understand people, and coming from people who had many good intentions, a lot of brilliant ideas, really magnificent minds, and also were, the technical term is bananas. There was not going to be a good outcome. And we're talking about a lot of people, probably many of us in the room, who are coming from a lot of trauma, from a lot of stress, predating this administration. And, there's only so much that we can expect from people who are not aware of their own internal motivations. Making a mess, and I'll speak for myself, of our personal lives and of our realities, and then thinking that we're going to get different results in our professional lives and in the world. And so there is, again, a case to be made for this inner transformation that must be paired with this work of outer transformation that we're trying to do. And there's no getting around that.
What do you say, Charles?
Well, I'm thinking of not only like why must the inner transformation be paired with the outer transformation? Partly because you can't actually do one without the other.
Yes. Yeah.
It's because the outer work reveals to you things that you wouldn't be able to see if you were just sitting on the meditation cushion. And this, speaks to what you were saying before about you said something like, we need to be out there doing. And usually when people say, you need to clean up your room, basically it is it has like a little bit of a, psychological threat to it. But if you take the words at face value in like a really generous way, instead of you need to do that, otherwise you're a bad person, otherwise I condemn you, otherwise you're going to be punished, you need to clean up your room, but you actually are taking that as a statement of spiritual insight, as from a place of generosity. What you need, like you have a need. You have a need, and I am your friend, and I want you to fulfill your needs. And one of the basic human needs is to contribute to something that is meaningful and beautiful to you. You can have all the money in the world, all the prestige, all the success, everything, but if you're not doing that, you will not be happy. One of the breakdowns that is underway in our time that far transcends any of the political drama going on right now is a breakdown in civilization's structures of sense and meaning. It used to be a generation or two ago, a bright young man could satisfy that need by participating in the grand project of civilization, in advancing technology and contributing in some way to progress, as it was called. In those days, it wasn't so obvious that progress meant the ruin of other cultures and ecologies, to the point where eventually even those who are doing the ruining suffer the ruin themselves because they're not actually separate from what is ruined. This is, so as that breaks down, as that the mythology of ascent, as I like to call it, breaks down, we're in a space between stories. And I think that's akin to paradox. Your stories don't make sense anymore. And when you hold that long enough, then new understandings come in, new and ancient understandings, actually, that echo a lot of spiritual teachings. That, for example, what you do to the other, you do to yourself. That we're not really separate. And technology, the very advances of the story of separation that seemed to promise a utopia a generation or two ago have birthed the crises that are awakening us to these buried truths. Nuclear weapons, for example, forever ended the idea that you could triumph once and for all over the other through force. Mutually assured destruction destroyed that delusion. It no longer is an option to completely eradicate your enemy. And global ecological collapse is also revealing the delusion that we can escape what we do to the other. It's a lot bigger than climate change, the ecological collapse. And it doesn't mean that we're going to die. It doesn't mean that we're going to go extinct like the rainforests and the whales and whatever else we extinguish. But it means that something in us dies every time that a species or an ecosystem or a place dies. And we become poorer and poorer, even if we do survive. So these are some of what comes available as we hold paradox and let go of our habitual ways of doing things.
It really reminds me and echoes Martin Luther King talking about how we're all connected. You know, many of his speeches were about how, whatever we do to another, we do to ourselves. And,
Yeah.
And there were, I forget the wonderful quote about being part of a tapestry, but it's so hard for us to keep that in our heads. It is this collective versus the individual paradox that I think we have such a difficult time with.
But in this sort of space between stories, or however it was you said, right? The idea, if we are in a place where old notions no longer make sense, or the systems that we had in place no longer work in the way that they did, there is something of a vacuum. And in that vacuum, you use the word need, and I think, again, I'm sort of going back to this thing about operating in good faith and whether the other person is, but like in a vacuum, false gods of all sorts will appear to fill any need.
And that's what happens. The story breaks down, and a demagogue or a fascist comes in with a very attractive story. Here, I'll make meaning of the world for you again, and it's another version of the old story. Like Donald Trump's story is winning. Well, we're going to make it work again. We're going to make America great again. We're going to make the old story work again. We're going to win again. But it contradicts the truth that we are wanting and needing to step into, which is that you cannot win when somebody else loses. Not in the big picture. Not in this time where humanity is wanting to and needing to and can come together out of the habits of tribalism. Tribalism has a positive aspect too. I don't want to say that cultures that had tribes are less advanced in some way. But you guys know what I mean.
But often those tribes didn't buy into a delusion of separation, right?
Right.
There was actually a deep connection to that,
Right.
that interdependence and that knowing. And we are the products of modernity and scientific materialism, not to deny science, but to that worship of a specific methodology that ignores the mystery and the not knowing. Thinking that we can quantify and know everything really robs us of that capacity for wonder and awe that connects us to that truth of interconnection.
Yeah.
I'm always so curious about why we are so uncomfortable with uncertainty. I mean, it is just, if you look at the newspapers here too, they're always trying to predict a future that's unknowable. The questions are always, will Trump win? Or, will the economy go down? Will we ever do this? And it's like, I don't know. I mean, it's not even a question I care to ask. I'm more interested in how are we doing now with one another? And what's the world we're creating together with one another? But people are so uncomfortable with uncertainty. I'm sure you see this in your meditation practice.
For sure. I mean, we all have built up these rational defenses against uncertainty, against mystery, and we're rewarded for that. I mean, we're trained in that through school, and undoing those defenses really requires us to open to mystery. This is what all the spiritual traditions point to, but so many of us have lost that because of wounding from religions and from the faith models that we've been given, but we haven't been given the alternatives to connect to that.
That's right.
Selassie, you were talking about the paradox of the two truths, and I have found myself, certainly in recent years, really interested in this word truth, the word truth, right? And in particular, it's sort of like there are different kinds of truths, right? And there, as you say, is like a universal truth, or for a journalist might say, this is a simple provable fact. You are in the room, right? That is true, right? But there's been this sort of mission creep on the word truth, right? The idea that when we say truth now, we sometimes mean provable fact. But how many times have you been in conversation with somebody where they'll be like, well, the truth is, and then they state an opinion. Or the truth is, and they say something that is, probably true in a way, but is not all things can be true in the same way. I think about that a lot, especially as journalists who, there is that kind of old thing of like, just tell the facts, tell the truth, But everybody feels like they're telling the truth. How do we grapple with that? What do we do with that?
I mean, I would go to look more deeply into the word truth and the word fact.
Right, I agree.
Fact comes from a Latin root that means to make or to do. And that's in the word manufacture, factory, factitious.
Yep.
So it does not originally mean something that is objectively true. There's an understanding that facts are things that we create, that they have a context. And as a journalist, you could report just the facts, but you are still selecting what facts to report. So that's already tendentious. It's not in some larger sense objective. And how do you know that it is provable? What do you accept as an authoritative source? What power structures are embedded and embodied by that authoritative source? These are all questions that make it hard to equate truth with anything objective. And if you look at the origin of the word, I believe it started as a verb that still has a vestigial use in phrases like to true a board.
That's exactly what it was from. Yeah,
right?
That's right. That's correct.
So it means to align you with something. So in that sense, when you say something is true, maybe what you mean is it is truing. It is aligning with something. And so there's like, when people choose their media based on whether it affirms what they already believe or affirms their deeply held values, maybe they're just being a little bit more honest with themselves about what everybody is always doing. And when we acknowledge that, as the saying goes, you can't reason somebody out of a belief they didn't reason themselves into to begin with, then we'll have a different basis of conversation.
Anybody got a question? We have time for about one question. Sorry, this has been an absorbing conversation. So we've got. Let's try to. Who put their hand up first? Just Sandy, pick someone. We'll try to get to a couple of these if we can.
First off, thank you all so much for an incredible hour. Second, Diana, I worked on that Tennessee 11 project that you referenced. So I need to talk to you after, but the great news is the proposal actually did get signed into law, one of them. Yeah.
That is fantastic.
Yeah,
That
and
is
we
great news.
replicated the process in Wisconsin on family well-being and abortion, and they are currently working to
That is-
pass a policy
that's
for
extraordinary.
postpartum women. Yeah.
Now, did you work with Judy Woodruff on this?
I did, yeah, yeah.
That's an extraordinary show. And
Yeah.
it's on America at the Crossroads, correct?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
Judy came with us to Tennessee to
Yeah.
talk about this, but
Yeah.
we run it through a project called the Builders Movement, which is all about overcoming
I know the
political
Builders
divide.
Movement, yeah.
Anyway, my question was, you all have talked about holding paradox and asking these questions and taking these actions. What are the qualities we need to cultivate in ourselves to do this work? Like, what are the qualities you all have cultivated in yourselves to be able to even have this conversation?
A great question.
I mean, I can start just from the contemplative perspective. It really is a process of turning inwards, right? And so for each of us to take some time and space in our lives to cultivate that in whatever ways make sense for us in terms of our faith practices or non-faith practices, but really to make that time. And it could be just being in nature, but to make that space for that paradox, for understanding that truth of interconnection, that we are not separate, and the truth that we are not the same, and that those differences don't have to be a problem.
I think for me, I very similar to that. I have a contemplative practice of my own, which is very connected to nature and very important. But the other thing that I think has, one of the ways I end up looking inward, which I think is always the answer, is when I'm interacting with someone, say my husband, and he reacts negatively to me, okay? The first thing I could say is, what a jerk, what the hell is he doing that for? But usually what I've learned to do is to say, what have I just done? Or what's going on with me such that I might have evoked that reaction? And how is that then leading him to respond? And how can we together change the dynamic? Because neither one of us can do it alone. For many of the reasons you said, if you're not, not in my marriage, but in many relationships, you're waiting for the other person to give the sign that they are trustable and you can take a risk. But if you see it as a pattern you together have created, that your internal subjectivity has now gone out into the world and created this external pattern, the only way you're going to change that is by going inside, each of you going inside, and then figuring out how you together can build a different relationship with one another.
Charles?
Gosh, I don't think I'm very qualified to give spiritual advice. For me,
Yeah, I know.
but
how do you
or
go
any
inside,
advice. It
how
comes.
do you go inside yourself in this work?
I hold a question.
Yeah.
I hold a
See,
question.
it's a great answer.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The question is, what is it like to be you?
that's a great question. Yeah.
We're at time. I'm so sorry, everybody. I really am sorry that I did not leave enough time for questions there, but I just, because we need the room, so we're going to have to clear out. But hang around, find these folks, talk to them. Thank you for spending time with us. Let's hear for our speakers.
Thank you.
And yeah, just, keep doing your thing.